Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a panel discussion on domestic violence in New York City during COVID-19, hosted by the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution. Thank you all for being with us. The Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College of Criminal Justice is dedicated to working with prosecutors, advocates, and community members across the country to develop a criminal legal system that promotes human dignity, protects public safety, and advances racial and gender equity. Many thanks to my colleagues at the IIP for your hard work planning today's event, and to our partners at Sanctuary for Families, the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, Style House, and the Brooklyn DA's Office for their support in addressing this absolutely urgent issue of domestic violence during the current pandemic. At the IIP, we begin our events with a living land acknowledgement. And to that end, we acknowledge that the IIP is based in New York City, which is Lenapehoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor the indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built New York City during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which inspires our ongoing work. Before we begin, given this uniquely difficult time globally, but in particular in our state and our city, I invite you all to join us in a moment of silence in recognition of community members we've lost in recent months and those who are currently suffering. Today's panel is very much on the subject of suffering and what local government and communities can do to prevent and address it during this crisis. We acknowledge that this content may be difficult, and we encourage participants to care for your safety and well-being throughout today's conversation and generally, and of course, to be mindful of and care for others. One innovation just launched by the Women's Funding Network is this signal for help that can be used as an alternative to 911 during this time of sheltering in place, which will be recognized by authorities and ideally ultimately by anyone as a sign of urgent distress. It involves, I'm just doing this for demo purposes, putting your palm to the camera, tucking the thumb, and trapping the thumb under the remaining 4 fingers. As you travel through the Zoom and video call universe, please educate others about this sign and be aware that it is a silent signal for help. I'm honored to see so many of our friends and partners here today. The panel is being recorded and guests will be muted for the duration. So please put your questions to the panelists by submitting them in writing through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will share them with the panelists as time allows throughout the conversation. I'm so pleased to introduce this morning's outstanding panelists. Jennifer DeCarli is the Assistant Commissioner for New York City Family Justice Centers and Outreach at the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. She oversees the operations of the city's 5 family justice centers, as well as outreach efforts across the city. She has 20 years experience working with survivors of domestic and gender-based violence in New York State, having served in leadership positions with the Family Court Program, the Staten Island Family and Criminal Court Program at Safe Horizon, the Brooklyn Family Justice Center, and at Her Justice. Dorchen LeidHoldt has served as the director of Sanctuary for Families Legal Center since 1994. It is the largest dedicated legal services program for domestic violence victims in the country. The center provides legal representation in family law, criminal, civil rights, public benefits, housing and immigration cases, and advocates for policy and legislative changes that further the rights of survivors of gender violence. Jane Doe is a part of the Sanctuary for Families Survivor Leadership Program, a training and certification course to equip survivors to make system-wide change through advocacy, training, program development, and direct work with other survivors. Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzalez has been a prosecutor at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office since 1995, serving in the Sex Crimes and Special Victims Bureau, Domestic Violence Bureau, and multiple trial bureaus. In 2017, DA Gonzalez became the first Latino district attorney elected in New York State, and he has since implemented groundbreaking reforms. Welcome, and many thanks to all. I'd like to start with a general question to anyone on the panel. For some people, increased media attention on domestic violence during COVID has really for the first time highlighted its pervasiveness in our communities. Prior to the outbreak of COVID, what were some broad strokes about the facts of domestic violence in the country and in New York City in particular?
Well, I'll begin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Gonzalez. You know, I started my career in the DA's office dealing with issues involving domestic violence and special victims cases. And so this is not new. New York City has always had an epidemic as it relates to domestic violence. The media attention may be more intense now. But the problems have existed here in this county for over 25 years since I've been a prosecutor. You know, domestic violence constitutes the largest single category of crimes that my office handles. Traditionally, we've handled anywhere between 8,000 and 10,000 domestic violence cases a year, and you know, these cases tend to be the most complicated to prosecute. You know, in Brooklyn, there's a strong infrastructure to help survivors of these crimes, in that we have a very strong domestic violence bureau that's well-staffed, with great expertise and strong relationships with domestic violence police officers and our partners like Sanctuary for Families and Safe Horizons, but especially our family justice centers and the mayor's office to end domestic violence and gender-based violence. We work very closely together. Our family justice center here in Brooklyn is co-located right next door to our domestic violence bureau. And so we have all of the organizations together to provide services to our communities. So while this may be getting renewed media attention, and obviously places like my office is also sending out the message to social media, this problem has been with us for a long time.
Right.
But we are working very closely to protect survivors of domestic violence, especially during this COVID crises where people are more isolated than ever before.
Yes. And Lucy, I'd be happy to just follow up with District Attorney Gonzalez's really important remarks. I mean, we know domestic violence is extraordinarily pervasive, that it impacts about 1 out of every 4 women and girls, and has a similar impact on members of the LGBTQI community. It typically is escalating, and its impact is devastating on survivors and their families. And I just, certainly the incidence of physical harm, we know how injurious it can be. The psychological harm often gets ignored. We see very high levels of trauma, especially post-traumatic stress disorder among the survivors that we serve. We welcome the media attention because when the shelter-in-place order went out, there wasn't sufficient understanding on the part of the public or systems that this placed domestic violence survivors in increased danger. So the media has done so much, and boy, the Third Estate, we need them as never before to raise awareness about the danger that survivors were in and the need for systems to respond forcefully and effectively. Too often, domestic violence is very physically injurious and even fatal. And since COVID-19 has started, we have faced several domestic violence homicides in New York City. So while historically systems have not recognized that fact, increasingly we're seeing law enforcement and others become aware of how dangerous domestic violence can be.
Thank you. And speaking of system needs, Jennifer, can you speak a little bit about the city's family justice centers? I think we have a wide range of experience amongst the folks in the audience. So if you could provide some background and then tell a little bit about the concerns around social distancing and shelter in place, and how in New York in particular, the family justice centers and other systems are concerned about the COVID-related policies affecting these issues.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thank you, Lucy, and to the Institute for inviting me to be on the panel and share the experiences that we're seeing at the Family Justice Centers. We we basically, the Family Justice Centers, the goal of the centers is to provide a one-stop shop for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. I don't love that analogy. It makes it sound like you're shopping at a mall or something, but really the goal is to provide one door that a survivor can enter to access as many services as possible in partnership with district attorneys' offices. As DA Gonzalez said, we're really lucky and privileged to work in such close partnership with our district attorneys in New York City, and also with our not-for-profit partners like Sanctuary for Families. So the goal is that the services are all free. They're client-centered, meaning the client chooses what services they'd like to offer. So if somebody wants to make a report to the police, that service is offered there. But if they don't yet feel that that's a safe option for them, they can receive case management or talk to lawyers like Sanctuary for Family about other options. Our goal is to really just listen to the survivor and provide that risk assessment and safety planning, doing that with the survivor, and then offering a whole range of services from crisis intervention, helping someone maybe get an order of protection, helping them to file that police report if they want, helping them to get connected to emergency shelter, all the way to long range services that really can help promote the safety and stability of their family, such as economic empowerment programming or help with resume and career readiness, things like that. So our goal is to put as many services in place as possible, allow survivors and their children to access them for free. And we have one center in every borough in New York City. We're really lucky. We have the largest network of family justice centers in the country, but this is a best practices model and one that's been done in close partnership with prosecutors, because for survivors who want to pursue a criminal justice remedy, it's really important that we have such well-trained prosecutors like we do at the Brooklyn DA's office that understand this work, can do it in a trauma-informed way, and understand how important it is to do it in collaboration with not-for-profit partners. So that's the model. The challenge is that when COVID hit us here in mid-March, that model relies on people walking into buildings, walking into physical spaces. We have over 40 partners between our city agencies and not-for-profit partners. And across the 5 centers in New York City, we record about 260 visits a day. So you obviously, when COVID hit, with the time of social distancing, not being able to be near each other, we needed to kind of pivot really quickly and figure out how to provide those services. Because if anything COVID's taught us, echoing DA Gonzalez and Dorchen, is that this has always been a pandemic, a social issue that we really have seen at high rates across the country and in New York City. But COVID has put into light those vulnerabilities survivors have always faced, right? And it's shining a spotlight on them. So we know that it's always been very challenging for survivors to leave, for many, many reasons. And COVID is making that so much more challenging, right? Sheltering at home is not safe for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. And so we've really had to pivot and work in partnership to provide our services in a new way. And so we now are providing our Family Justice Center services virtually. So our staff and Safe Horizon staff in the city are taking live calls every day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. at the centers, and then screening clients and connecting them to our partners like Sanctuary for Families, or perhaps back to a district attorney if they have questions about what's going on with their case, as so many people, really uncertain about what's going on right now. And so we're able to do that now by phone, and we're seeing about 75 clients contacting us a day through the 5 Family Justice Centers in New York City.
Thank you. We talked a little bit about the unique challenges around sheltering in place. And Jane Doe, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to what the challenges of being a survivor during COVID are for people who have been able to leave. So beyond simply sheltering in place.
Yes, thank you. It's an honor to be here. The first kind of meeting or contact with a group of survivors was about a month after the stay-home order. And it was a group of 5-6 survivors that, were also associated with Sanctuary for Family. And it was one of the hardest meetings I ever had online. I think it is a very triggering time for survivors because we're again being asked to stay home, that we cannot leave. And I always cry when I have to talk about this, so forgive me. But I think it's extremely difficult and triggering time for survivors.
Thank you. DA Gonzalez, how has your office been managing domestic violence complaints and arrests as they've been coming in since these new orders?
Well, I can tell you that the arrest in terms of reported cases regarding gender-based violence is down significantly in the city. It's down in Brooklyn, which is concerning to all of us because we know that this is a particularly difficult time for families who are locked in an apartment or a house together, and that, you know, we understand and we hear from, you know, people that in fact, you know, incidents of domestic violence are increasing, but the reported number is going down. We're down significantly in Brooklyn in terms of reported cases. We also, coupled with sort of a massive sickness with our police department, where upwards of 20% of the police department was out ill at one point, so that some of the safety checks that they were doing on known domestic violence survivors and problems were not happening. That's starting to happen again now, and arrests are way down in the county for most crimes. So largely, domestic violence is about a third of all the cases we arraign in the county. So we know that, you know, there is a significant issue, but as people are sheltered in place, we also understand that their access to be able to report this is very limited. They don't have the same interactions that they normally have had. Often the abuser is not leaving the house at all, so they're really trapped. And then you couple that with what we've also unfortunately seen with what's happening on Rikers Island, and we're really putting these survivors in a really difficult place, because if they call the police, do they want their significant other to be part of this arrest processing, which might include going to central booking, being confined in a small space, possibly getting exposed to COVID and bringing that back to the family, or going to Rikers Island, where there was a tremendous vector of that disease. And so people were reluctant and made to feel guilty for even moving forward with these reports. And so it's a particularly difficult time in this work, because a lot of the ways that the police would deal with it is when someone would call them for help after the abuser had left the apartment, or when they were able to go to work. And as we're getting ready now to start the process of proceeding in court on these cases, we're about to start doing preliminary hearings. We believe in the near future, we're concerned that we can have those virtual preliminary hearings in a safe way. So we're going to have to get into these homes and make sure that our survivors are able to move forward on their case. I should say to anyone that's listening that the Brooklyn DA's office, like all DA's offices, are essential employees. The office is open. Most of the staff is teleworking. But if there are issues, we can respond to victims and survivors of these crimes to many of their concerns. And our social workers have been tremendous in Brooklyn in getting services virtually to survivors of crime. And so I don't want anyone who's listening to think that we can't help. We can help, and we're open and working, and we expect in the near future to start vigorously pursuing some of these cases, whether it be virtual or in person, but moving forward on these cases.
So in addition to, and sometimes instead of, perhaps Dorchen and Jane, you could speak a bit to what community-based organizations are doing on the kind of non-criminal response side to support survivors during this time.
Yes. So, I mean, we pretty much did. We're very, very close partners with the Family Justice Centers. We're in the Family Justice Centers. And when the Family Justice Centers went virtually, we began going virtually as well. Oh, excuse me, I'm having a little technical problem because someone called me. Let me see if I can get right back to this meeting. Sorry, apologies. And so we were shocked initially to see a big, or maybe not utterly surprised, but a significant decrease in calls to our hotline, to our helpline. Happy to see pretty quickly a steady stream of referrals from family justice centers. So we began working and serving survivors remotely and began to strategize about how we can get the word out to survivors to the greatest extent possible that we are still there. You might not be able to walk into our offices now, but we are there. And so there was a concerted effort to get our helpline and hotline numbers out, and happily it's been successful. We've seen an increase. You know, initially when we were seeing a decrease in calls, we were seeing a dramatic increase in online traffic on our website, and I know the family justice centers have seen the same thing. So it just underscored the fact that there's survivors out there that need our help. And I had a disconcerting experience. I have been going into my office periodically, and as I was coming out last Sunday, I looked outside my office building as I was exiting to take an Uber home, and there was a survivor with her 3 little kids standing out in the cold, 9:30 at night, needing help. She didn't have an iPhone, and she didn't have a computer, and she didn't have a cell phone, didn't know how to get help. And it just underscored, we were able to bring her into our shelter immediately, but it underscored the fact that there are survivors out there that we are not reaching, and that worries us a lot. We are working principally remotely. We've stepped up our efforts. We now have a live helpline for civil orders of protection and other legal issues, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. We didn't have that to that extent previously, and we're trying to increase those hours. So we're doing everything that we can to get the word out, and we were very heartened recently. We've been successful in getting our information out to urgent cares. And our helpline number is now being displayed on 100 New York City taxis. We're doing everything possibly we can to reach survivors who may not know where to go for assistance.
And I also want to add that I'm in at least 3 different mutual aid groups in the local neighborhood, and these mutual aid groups are collecting information about resources, and I receive a lot of information from the Sanctuary for Family and from my own Survivor Leaders Network, and I was able to share all those information and respond to private messages if someone or someone's neighbor seems like they need help.
Yes, one other thing I wanted to mention, we've developed a survey, and we're actually telephoning every single survivor we're serving to find out about their needs. We are assisting them with a very simple survey to assess not only their legal needs, but their urgent material needs. You know, with massive rates of unemployment, that not only creates greater danger for survivors, but survivors are facing an economic crisis here in New York City like never before. Entire industries have gone down, and they're the industries often that employed our clients. So that has been the source of great concern for us.
In Chicago, the mayor's office partnered with Uber and Lyft to provide free rides for survivors. Rise Now has partnered with businesses nationwide to establish safe havens for survivors. And we have a question from an audience member, Jana Myrowitz-Turner, about your perspectives on how the private sector can help, thinking about hotel rooms and other kinds of needs.
Wow.
So if any of you have thoughts on that, thank you, Dorchen.
Yes, well, you know, so I'll give you an example, and I just wanted to underscore, you know, systems response has been imperfect and maybe not surprising. One of the biggest challenges we initially found was a heightened standard by New York City family courts for the issuance of civil orders of protection. We were able to communicate our concern about that heightened standard that was articulated as life or death. And now it is the normal standard, the standard that's articulated in our Family Court Act. But that was just one example of the problems. We've actually seen problems with police response. And I'll give you an example of that. I think police responding to COVID-19 are very reluctant to respond the way they ordinarily would, even though the survivor may be in grave danger. One of our clients had been beaten up by her abuser, was covered with bruises, called the police. The police did not arrest him. They perhaps for the kinds of concerns articulated by DA Gonzalez. Sorry, I'm getting a steady stream of calls from clients as we speak, and left her in that dangerous situation. The next day, her abuser attacked her with a knife. She called 911. The police arrested him when she was before a criminal, when he, the abuser, was before a criminal court judge at arraignment. The judge issued an order of protection that permitted him to go into the home at night. That put her in grave danger. We immediately put her up in a hotel, and we're seeking an exclusionary order of protection through a civil protective order proceeding. But hotel rooms are really important. Yes, Lyft and gifts of Lyft and Uber, never so important, not only for survivors, but for staff of organizations like Sanctuary, because we are going out and meeting our clients who are in urgent situations where they are and providing them with food and other necessities, because I don't think we can't simply respond remotely. That's not going to do it. We also have to be there at times in person.
Thank you, Dorchen. So can folks contribute directly to those efforts through Sanctuary's website?
Oh, absolutely. We would so welcome those efforts. I mean, we're facing enormous urgent need as never before, and that would be so deeply appreciated.
Thank you. Jennifer, if you could talk a little bit about what's happening in the shelter world and when people are able to be relocated, who's doing the relocating, how is it working, and how is the city managing the shelter system in this time?
Sure. So the New York City shelter system is complex, as everything is in New York City. We have a homeless shelter system and a domestic violence shelter system. Both shelter systems are open. Domestic violence shelter systems are run by Human Resources Administration, HRA, in the city, and there is capacity in the shelter system at the moment. But I think going into shelter is always a very difficult decision for survivors when we're not dealing with COVID, right? And I think that during this time of COVID, for many of the reasons we've already highlighted, I think survivors often feel a lot of concerns about taking themselves and their family into shelter. But I do think it's really important for people to know that the shelter system is in place. It's running in partnership. Most of the shelters are run through not-for-profits like Sanctuary for Families, and they offer very, very supportive services and spaces for survivors, which you're not going to necessarily find in a hotel room, right? And so I think it's important for people to know that the shelter system is up and operating. They have rigorous screening policies in place for COVID that are being kind of administered and overseen by our Department of Health in the city. And so I want people to know that that option is still there, because I think it's an important option for survivors. We at the centers are working with a lot of high-risk cases right now where survivors are weighing that option, but also thinking about hotels possibly, but also thinking about relocating out of the city. And, you know, to your question about what can the private sector do, there is such a need, as Dorchen said, for just concrete support and assistance for survivors, even things like phones with minutes.
Right.
You know, we have survivors who are calling and saying their phones have been destroyed or their phones are compromised, right? Because now they're living with the abuse, they can't get away from the abusive partner. You know, so we've had to get really creative with safety planning. We have a partnership with an agency at NYU through Cornell Tech, where they actually can do privacy checkups with survivors still remotely for survivors who are concerned about those issues. But I think, you know, the private sector, we in the city collect our donations through the Mayor's Fund to Advance New York City. And we recently were really excited to learn that we've obtained a donation from, I have to look down because this is kind of a long name, but the Rihanna's Clara Lionel Foundation in collaboration with Twitter and Square CEO Jack Dorsey and Jay-Z's Sean Carter Foundation. We're going to be able to launch a program soon to provide survivors with unconditional micro grants to really give them that like cash infusion that you're going to need to be able to deal with this. And so that will help pay for things like phones with minutes and relocation costs and things like that. But anything the private sector can do, they can find information at the Mayor's Fund Advance New York City about contributing to those sorts of efforts, as well as obviously through our not-for-profits like Sanctuary for Families at their web pages.
Terrific. And we can make all of those links available on the IIP website, prosecution.org. So any listeners should feel free to check there for those resources. DA, I wanted to ask you about how, given your office's really laudable efforts to decrease the Rikers Island population, how you've been balancing those efforts with concerns about victims' safety in domestic violence cases.
Yes, it's as we've been trying to reduce the likelihood of death and the increased infection rates on Rikers Island, and the issue of domestic violence has come up often. And for me, it's pretty simple. We want to make sure that everything that we do in this office is focused on public safety and fairness. And in terms of domestic violence, we've really engaged our victims and survivors of these gender-based crimes in a very significant way with our social workers. So there are cases that you've probably heard that the city has released individuals on city sentences. Some were done over the objection of DAs, and there was a lot of concern that there had not been any safety planning done. The assistant district attorneys in my office with our social workers have really stepped up to provide services and to do safety planning. We've really gone a long way in terms of trying to provide alternative housing, and not just shelter housing, but other forms of housing, looking at needs of, for food and medication and other things to try to make sure that our survivors were safe. We wanted to make sure that orders of protection were in effect, and if not, we provided assistance to go through family court, the virtual service in family court, to get these orders of protection. So we've really done a lot to make sure that those who are released from Rikers Island, whether it's being done in coordination with a DA or done through parole or some other efforts through DOC, are been done responsibly. But quite frankly, it's been my position that these are the cases that are not safe for mass releases. And whenever we're even considering one of those cases, we're definitely reaching out to the survivor of that case to get their feedback on what they think. And in a number of limited cases, there have been survivors who, because of health conditions of the abuser, have wanted them out of Rikers Island because they're still, in some cases, the parent of a child in common. And so there have been some limited releases, but, that was one of the things that the DAs really pushed back on in terms of the Rikers Island releases, was that without appropriate safeguards, this was not a group of individuals that we thought could be safely returned just by being released. And so it's a balance like everything else that we do, but the work of making sure that we could help stop the spread in Rikers Island was an important task, and something that I think we've done a tremendous job with in terms of the city. But in terms of these gender-based violence and domestic violence, it's my position that these are not the cases that are most suitable for release.
Right. I just thank you so much. Those are very tough judgment calls to make, DA Gonzalez, and we are so grateful that you're making them so sensitively, consulting survivors. Of course, we're aware that very often enormous pressure is brought on survivors by abusers indirectly. But I wanted to focus on the fact that they're also incarcerated. There are survivors who are incarcerated on Rikers Island and in New York State prisons and in prisons all over the country. And gender-based violence survivors, domestic violence survivors who end up in situations in which they are criminalized are the survivors that are least likely to be part of recidivism. There's a new, really important remedy that's available in New York State called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. And we are rolling out a concerted effort to provide representation to as many survivors as possible in this circumstance. And this is something that district attorneys' offices can do all over the country, can join with advocates like attorneys at Sanctuary for Families, members of our Incarcerated Gender Violence Survivor Initiative, to ensure the release of gender violence survivors. As we speak, we're talking with an incarcerated survivor on Rikers Island now. No history of no criminal history whatsoever, and she's in great danger. Tragically, they're a survivor of severe gender-based violence who was incarcerated at Bedford Hills, died of COVID-19 recently. We've learned of other incarcerated survivors who are ill with COVID-19. So this is the time to really think about what we can do to ensure the release of those very vulnerable survivors, some of whom really should not have been incarcerated in the first place.
The DA mentioned some of the unique challenges around cases in which there are children in common. And of course, there are a whole host of unique issues for children who are experiencing abuse either firsthand or within the home. Can one of you speak to the particular challenges related to children and domestic violence?
I think Jane Doe might like to take that really important question.
While this memory and experience of abuse was never really behind me, I also have a child with my abuser. And I just feel like I have continued to live with the extent of the abuse through these years of interaction with my child's father over visitation issues. And I do believe that in a way, my abuser is to use visitation to extend this abuse and his anger on me. So during when COVID-19 and stay-home orders started in New York City, and when I realized that the COVID-19 situation was escalating, and I had made a decision to suspend all the physical visitation and move them to virtual visitation. So that means video conferences, text messages, and phone calls. So our daughter, who's 10 years old, can feel safe and not feel like she's being forced to go outside and traveling during the pandemic when, you know, the city, the mayor, the governor is asking everyone to stay home. And these frequent physical exchange could very likely expose both his and my household to the virus. And I pleaded with my child's father, and I tried to reason with him. And he became angry and threatening me with legal actions because I was violating the visitation order. And he claimed that I'm cutting off his access to the child, even though that is not true, and he was offered virtual visitation via video conferencing tools and phones. And I also know that that's the accusation that my abuser will be using against me in the future. And I'm really worried that I'm worried that the court does not recognize how much abuse are being extended through the means of visitation, and even long after obtaining an order of protection. And I'm really worried that the court would punish the survivors as a result of COVID-19. And I'm really afraid that when this emergency is over and a lot of survivors who has not been complying on this visitation issues could face serious ramification.
Yeah.
And at the other end of the spectrum, we know that COVID-19 has tremendously impacted elderly communities. And have you all made observations about instances of elder abuse during the time of sheltering in place? And what are the responses to those particular challenges?
Yes.
So we are part of an elder abuse coordination work group at the mayor's office that meets weekly to talk about those very issues, Lucy. We are noticing an uptick in calls to our family justice centers from elders who are experiencing abuse. So we're working closely with our partners that provide social services and provide legal services, and our DA partners. You know, elders are particularly vulnerable for so many reasons, and even when there are orders of protection, you know, there's a lot of pressure to allow the family member to return to the home, and so elders are experiencing that right now. I think the social services are really trying to figure out ways to provide programming to reduce the isolation. You know, all survivors are feeling isolation, and with elders, I think it's particularly challenging, you know, to not have the senior centers that maybe they were getting out to go to and things like that. So the city's been working really hard on that, you know, bringing, having meals at least for elders still dropped off, but it's a challenge. It's a real challenge that we're facing.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, Oh, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say we've noticed an uptick as well in our cases. The sort of social isolation that Jen mentioned is particularly problematic with our elder population, who really may not be safe to go outside even to do shopping. They become more dependent on some of their abusers. They're more isolated. And as economics has hit, communities, especially communities of color, very hard, many of the abusers are now extorting and demanding money from the elders. And so we've seen a tremendous uptick in terms of, these children and grandchildren of individuals really being in increasingly controlling positions over the elders. And we've been working very closely, and I really want to give a shout out to some of the social workers in my office who have done tremendous work in reaching out and calling individuals to make sure that we're doing as much as we can for them, which also have included like changing locks and doing other services, but also making sure that their basic needs are being met in terms of getting them the food delivered and things, so that they can have a little bit more space from the person who they may have to rely on to do some of the shopping and other things.
So concretely, what would you recommend that someone do who is experiencing elder abuse or observes it?
Well, we want everyone to call the police and call 911 if there's an issue. A lot of times there are violations of orders of protection. Working with our partners that are on this call today is another factor. Like, my office is open, and again, people can reach out directly to my office. I'll make sure we leave the number when we end this segment to make sure that we're involved. But this is really where we need the community to step up, right? I mean, I think that we've seen during these terrible times, we've seen New Yorkers of all stripes, really some of the best of New York, coming out and helping each other and making sure that we check in on our neighbors, especially our elders, and to make sure that they're not so vulnerable and isolated. And I've seen that in my neighborhood, where there's been, extended deliveries of food and other ways of connecting with elders. And I just say to the people of New York City, especially people in Brooklyn, to check in with their neighbors who may be isolated and give them social support. And if you can afford to, make donations to the entities that are providing services to this community.
We know that immigrant communities are amongst the least likely to report. And we have a great question as to whether resources are being translated for Spanish-speaking communities to ensure that they have access to the public health and public safety information you've discussed.
So Lucy, I also oversee outreach for our office, and we're currently working really hard to get our resources and information about the Family Justice Center numbers and our virtual our online site called NYC Hope. It's a domestic violence portal. You just type NYC Hope and it will give you information about resources throughout the city. We're working to get flyers out into hard hit communities in our top 10 languages in the city. So we're hoping to have those out very soon because it's a requirement being a mayoral office. You provide all those resources in the top languages. And we too are concerned, about immigrant survivors being able to reach out. And so we're very lucky to also work in close partnership with our immigration legal agencies who are still available to do immigration consultations and work with survivors who have concerns about immigration issues during this time as well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
At Sanctuary for Families, 75% of our clients are immigrants. Many are undocumented and partially documented. And they are in a triple bind at this point, with gender-based violence, COVID-19, and really fear of accessing our criminal justice system because of the presence of immigration customs enforcement in immigrant communities and horrifically enough, even in our very courts. And so we are making a concerted effort to reach out to these survivors in all of the languages that they speak, ensuring that all of our outreach materials are translated into multiple languages. And some of the in-person meetings that we've we've carried out, getting in an Uber and going to the location of a survivor has been with our immigrant survivors who often are not eligible for public benefits, have lost their jobs in the informal economy, are in a really, really just grave risk on every front.
Thank you.
We have a very robust immigration intervention project at Sanctuary for Families, and we're handling the same level of cases. We've even stepped up our efforts because there are, as many of you know, dedicated immigration legal remedies available to survivors of domestic and other forms of gender-based violence. And in spite of difficulties with the current administration in securing those remedies, we are having success and really doing our best to reach every survivor, immigrant survivor who needs immigration legal representation.
Thank you. Jennifer, we just had a question from the audience for clarification. Are all the family justice centers closed for in-person walk-ins?
Yes, all of the centers at the moment are closed. And we like to lead, though, that we're still here. We're still here virtually. All of those numbers for the Family Justice Center's phones can be accessed at the NYC Hope site. And they are still open and taking live calls every single day. And honestly, completely functioning like a Family Justice Center if you walk through the doors. We're just doing all of that work virtually. Because of the stay-at-home orders and because many of the offices and buildings are closed and many of our partners have gone to remote work, we had to make that difficult decision in March.
Thank you. I really appreciate, Jane Doe, you raising the issue of visitation as a form of ongoing abuse. And I think that there are so many ways in which these unique circumstances can flag for us some of the different ways in which abuse can manifest itself. And in particular, I wonder whether any of you can speak to concerns around digital and online abuse in the current environment and a prevalence or increase, if there is one, around the use of technology as tools for abuse. Dorchen?
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that issue. It is so in the calls that we're getting, we're now seeing a growing number of calls on our legal helpline. We are hearing over and over again about abusers using cybersexual abuse, abusers who are quote unquote sheltering in place with their victims, survivors, using it as a threat to keep the survivors from leaving, from seeking help from authorities, and abusers who have been separated from their victims, making those threats about cybersexual abuse. So we have seen an increase, and other organizations have as well. New York State has a relatively new law that makes cybersexual abuse and a misdemeanor, really, really important. It is also is the basis of getting a civil order protection. And in some of our cases, before family court judges in the new virtual courts, judges are issuing orders as part of the order protection that prohibits the abuser from engaging in cybersexual abuse.
Yeah, and I think Jessica Morak, that works for Sanctuary for Families, has a video on how to combat cyber sexual abuse. For us in the DA's office, and we should make sure that resource is made available to the public. But for our perspective, that these are the type of cases that are proceeding in court now. People should call 911 if they can, when it is safe to do so, and we will hold these offenders accountable.
Yes. Thank you. As we're starting to see shelter-in-place orders conclude in many places, Jane Doe, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to your concerns about what the legacy of COVID-19 will be for domestic violence survivors in our city.
This time is the most triggering time for survivors of domestic violence, and especially when survivors are being asked not to leave the house and to stay home in isolation. And when everyone's staying at home and with these thin walls between us and our next door neighbors, the fear and trauma of violence at home will become almost like a collective trauma of our society. And as I mentioned before, as a survivor who also have a child with my abusers, I'm dealing with a different set of fear and issues in the legal system. And I really hope to see the kind of support from criminal system and the society and the family court system that can prioritize the safety and well-being of the survivors to, ease this collective trauma.
Thank you. There has been a fair amount written about the concern that schools where traditionally child abuse and domestic violence can be flagged since we're remote learning, that there are limitations to what schools can be able to do. Jen, can you speak at all to ways in which folks are supporting teachers or agencies are supporting teachers to enable them to continue serving in that function right now?
Sure. Our office has been working with ACS and DOE on this issue and thinking about providing support and trainings to DOE. We've been doing some of that pre-COVID and have been in discussions with them about doing more of it now. And so ACS has issued some new guidance on their policies during this time, and I believe that's on our NYC Hope website. There's a whole kind of survivor update page. But I think we just need to continue working closely with them. I mean, to your legacy question, Lucy, I think this has taught us as providers that we need to really be thinking thoughtfully and creatively about the way we provide services and be ready very quickly to pivot and respond to the needs of survivors, right? We can't necessarily be 9 to 5 anymore in the time of COVID, right? We have survivors calling us at 11 o'clock at night because that's the only safe time, right? And so I think it's challenged all of us, and I'm sure Dorchen will agree, it's challenged all of us to really think about, we have a responsibility to up our game and make sure we're providing services that make sense for survivors, and looking at our systems to make sure, like your question, that we are now figuring out ways to still have eyes on children in this new remote learning, right? And how do we do that? So I'm sure Dorchen would agree with all of that, but we'd have some more examples.
Yes, I mean, there always are, this crisis is devastating. And Jane Doe talking about for survivors and actually for advocates for survivors who suffer often from trauma themselves, vicarious trauma, it has been extraordinarily triggering. But there are opportunities, and there are opportunities to see things differently and do things differently. I think we're now realizing that we don't actually have to have survivors get on the train, get on the bus, spend an hour and a half on public transportation to come into our offices to get services, that we can provide services to them remotely that can be very, very effective. Food pantries, unfortunately not enough are available, but we have a food pantry in our office for survivors to come into our offices and collect canned goods and take them back on public transportation to their homes. There's a better way to get survivors resources. So I think we can end up being even more survivor-centered. And I think law enforcement, that is so crucial. Police and prosecutors, I think, are having awareness of the real danger that survivors have always been in. And I think this is a little bit of a wake-up call to our society as a whole about the need to prioritize survivor safety. So I think that there are lots of lessons to be learned, and our communication among staff at Sanctuary for Families and with our partners has never been greater. So I can't say that it's really a silver lining to the cloud, because the cloud is so formidable and big and dark, but there are some glimpses of hope and opportunity in this extraordinarily difficult time.
I think I agree 100% with Dorchen. I think this is a watershed moment for all of us about how we do our jobs, and to come to the realization that we can do actually maybe even more than we did in the traditional model by allowing people to access us in this telework virtual reality that we exist in. I wanted to talk a little bit about the children of domestic violence, because the trauma that these children are under in not having sort of the normalcy of their life is something that we cannot underestimate. A lot of these children have been locked away and have been completely isolated from any sense of normalcy. And I expect that we will see over the next several years that there's going to be a lot of PTSD and trauma that's related to what's happened. And so we have to be mindful, not only as law enforcement to these needs, but in our social service world.
Yes.
Thank you. Before we conclude, I would love to ask if you would each share anything that you want to say to survivors who may be suffering in silence in the city right now.
I'll say I want all of our survivors to know that the employees of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office care tremendously about them, their safety, their well-being. We always look at the trauma and provide services that we are done in coordination with the wishes of our victims and survivors. So what that means is, we take into consideration what your needs are and what your desires and wishes are. And you don't have to always, want to see a prosecution to, go forward to access help. We're here to, make sure that offenders are held accountable, but we're also here just to make sure that people are safe and are treated with human dignity and have a sense of agency in how things are handled. And so please don't hesitate to call us or to go forward simply because you don't want to see your abuser go to jail. There are other services and other ways of helping you other than saying we're going to put someone in jail. And I think that sometimes people are reluctant to call, and maybe they need multiple incidents before they call because they only think that the system has one solution for their problems. And I'm trying to assure people that yes, we can lock someone up and incarcerate someone when needed and necessary for safety, but there's so much more that we can do that deals with the actual trauma that the victim is going through and making sure that they're safe.
Yes. I mean, I would say to survivors that we recognize that your needs are greater and more multifaceted than ever before. And the response to those needs has to be multifaceted and holistic. We recognize the very serious safety issues that you're facing now. And when you call 911 or pursue a civil order protection family court, it doesn't necessarily mean that your abuser is going to end up locked up in jail. The vast majority of these cases don't have those kinds of dispositions, but family court and police prosecutors are providing vitally important protections, but there are a whole array of other urgent needs that survivors have, from representation in immigration proceedings, assistance accessing public benefits now, and other forms, and then just assistance addressing urgent needs. There is a really vital public-private partnership in New York City embodied by our family justice centers, and we are there for you. We are there for you.
And I would just echo everything that Dia Gonzalez and Dorchen said, but really that we are here for you. We want to hear from you. We will work with you creatively to figure out when it's safe to engage with us. We will call you at 11 o'clock if that's the only time. We want to hear from you. We want to work for you. And I would, Lucy, just add, for community members, it's really important to spread the word that services are available. And, social distancing doesn't have to mean emotionally distancing, right? And put up information in your apartment buildings about services. NYC Hope, if you type that in, you will get every single person's information here, about how to access services. And that's really simple. And I think it's just important to be like an ambassador in your community, that this is an important issue pre-COVID, and it's even more important now during COVID. And so the information you have, knowledge is power, right? So the more we can all do as a community to help survivors and let them know we care and we're here is really important.
I really want to support everyone on the panel and just to mention that I have received support or some form of support from every single organization on this panel. And to this day, I'm still a client of the Sanctuary for Family. And I wanted to also tell everyone that you know, you can call the police and there's a domestic violence police officer in every precinct. That actually supported me tremendously over the past decades of the incidents and even with visitation exchange, and they're extremely thoughtful and kind, and that really had helped me tremendously.
Thank you all so much for being with us. We will post links for people who want to contribute resources to support this important work, and we will post links that contain resources for community members who need them. We encourage you all to support one another, to reach out. And I am so very grateful to all of our panelists for all that you're doing to support the city and to support community members who are suffering right now. And thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us and share this important message with New York City. Thank you so much to all of you. Be very safe and well. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again in person, hopefully safely and soon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
folks.
you.
Thank you.